It was just past 2:15 in the morning when the red and blue lights started flashing through the windows of my cabin, cutting through the pitch-black mountain night like knives. My heart pounded as I sat bolt upright in bed. The deepest sleep I'd had in months shattered in an instant. Radio static crackled outside, followed by the heavy slam of car doors. Then came that voice, sharp, demanding, slicing through the quiet like she owned the mountain itself. I pulled on my robe and padded to the window, the cold hardwood floor biting at my bare feet. 2 patrol cars sat in the gravel driveway, their lights painting the tall pines in violent streaks. A couple of officers stood listening to a woman in her mid-50s, gesturing wildly at my cabin with a thick binder clutched in her manicured hands. She'd been watching me ever since I arrived 3 days earlier, phone glued to her ear like I was some kind of threat. This cabin in the Cedar Ridge community up in the Sierra foothills had belonged to my grandfather, who passed 6 months ago. The estate lawyer told me there was no rush on the paperwork, so this was my first trip back since the funeral. I'd come up on a Friday, hoping for a quiet weekend in the place where he'd taught me about standing your ground and dealing with bullies the right way. 15 years working in county housing code enforcement had taught me to stay calm and document everything first. I reached for the leather folder on the nightstand, my driver's license, the notarized inheritance papers, and my work credentials all neatly inside. The documents were solid, but there was one loose end. I hadn't yet recorded the deed transfer with the county recorder's office. From the window, I watched her, Diane Hargrove, according to the name on her mailbox, handing the officers a professional-looking packet, property records, HOA documents, photos of the place sitting empty for months, then suddenly occupied. She'd clearly pulled county records and dug through association files. "I'm Diane Hargrove," she announced with authority, president of the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association for the past 15 years. "This property has been vacant until this man showed up 3 nights ago without any notice." She'd turned my perfectly legal arrival into what sounded like a crime. The officers studied her materials under their flashlights, nodding as she laid out her security concerns. One of them glanced at his partner. It wasn't just a noise complaint. This was about possible fraud. She went on. "This looks like organized squatting. These people research deceased owners, find empty homes, and move in with forged papers." She even quoted California Civil Code sections about removing unauthorized occupants. Her preparation was impressive, I'll give her that. Porch lights flicked on up and down the street as neighbors stepped out to watch. Police visits were rare up here, and Diane clearly enjoyed the audience. The lead officer, Morgan, approached my door while Diane stood behind him like she was about to win a court case. "That's him," she declared as I opened up. "The man illegally occupying this property." "Good evening, officers," I said calmly, the steady tone that comes from years on the other side of these conversations. "I have documentation if you'd like to see it." Morgan asked for proof of my right to be there. I handed over the inheritance papers and ID. They looked legitimate, but Diane had spotted the gap. No recorded deed yet. "Probate is ongoing," I admitted honestly. Diane jumped in smoothly. "I understand family loss is difficult, but an unrecorded inheritance doesn't grant occupancy rights under county rules." She quoted more codes, sounding compassionate yet firm. The officers exchanged looks. Her homework was holding their attention. I could have ended it right then by showing my county credential, the one that listed my title as Senior Housing Code Enforcement Supervisor, but something held me back. I'd spent years investigating exactly this kind of overreach, intimidation disguised as community protection. I wanted to see how far she'd take it. The officers reviewed everything carefully, clearly impressed by Diane's binder, but puzzled by my calm. Most people in my position would be nervous or defensive. I just wasn't. Morning came, and at exactly 9 a.m., a white SUV with Cedar Ridge HOA decals pulled in, followed by Diane's sedan. 3 people emerged: Diane, a tall man named Richard Ellis carrying a briefcase, and a woman named Laura Bennett with a tablet and measuring tape. "Mr. Thompson," Diane called out formally as I opened the door. "My name is Robert Thompson, by the way. Overnight research confirmed issues with your occupancy. While your inheritance seems valid, you've triggered multiple compliance violations." She handed me a printed document claiming interim occupancy, required 72-hour HOA notification, and estate properties needed review during probate. The fine? $300 per day retroactive to my first night. Richard explained they'd handled 20 similar situations this year, cooperate, and avoid bigger costs. Laura circled the cabin, snapping photos of every tiny issue. A hedge slightly overgrown, faded address numbers, a stain on the deck railing. It was a polished routine, team approach, specific dollar amounts, implied urgency, all designed to overwhelm. Instead of shutting it down, I asked polite questions, letting them lay out their full playbook. I wanted the documentation for what I already suspected, systematic intimidation. Diane produced a pre-printed payment form for $1,500 to resolve everything quietly. Otherwise, formal violations filed the next day. She even posted a notice on my front door for all the neighbors to see. By evening, people who'd waved the day before now avoided eye contact. The social pressure was immediate and effective. That night, I called a colleague back at the county office with a hypothetical about HOA overreach during probate. Her answer confirmed it. No such fees or mandatory reviews existed. This was a shakedown. At 8:30 p.m. the next evening, Diane called 911 again, her voice carrying across the quiet ridge. Persistent trespassing, refusal to comply with lawful directives, potential for escalation in an isolated location. 2 patrol cars arrived at 9:15. This time Sergeant Hayes was in charge, along with Morgan and Wilson from the first visit. I opened the door before they knocked, hands visible, calm as ever. Diane handed over her updated folder. Timelines, violation notices, photos. The officers reviewed my inheritance papers again. Then, as Wilson flipped through my portfolio, he spotted the county credential tucked behind the inheritance packet. The shift was instant. Morgan's eyes widened. He showed Wilson, then Sergeant Hayes leaned in. They recognized the title immediately. "Mr. Thompson," Hayes said carefully, "I need to confirm your current position with the County Housing Department." "Senior Code Enforcement Supervisor," I replied evenly. "I oversee housing code compliance countywide, including HOA practices." The silence that followed was absolute. Diane's binder slipped from her hands, papers scattering across the gravel like fallen leaves. Her face went pale as the officers explained to her exactly who she'd been harassing for 4 days. "Ma'am," Morgan said gently, "this gentleman supervises the department that investigates HOA enforcement issues." Sergeant Hayes apologized for the inconvenience. Though I told him it wasn't necessary, Diane had followed what she thought were proper channels. I simply pointed out, in the same professional tone I use with residents every day, that HOA rules cannot override county housing codes, that manufacturing fees and emergency assessments during probate was not permitted, and that repeated false police reports against a legal resident crossed clear lines. Diane tried once more, but he never notified the HOA. "Mrs. Hargrove," I said, "heirs have occupancy rights during probate. Notification to your association is not required by law." Neighbors had gathered by then, watching the reversal unfold. The woman who'd been the unchallenged guardian of community standards for 15 years stood speechless as her carefully built case became evidence against herself. Monday morning back at the office, I opened an official case file. Within days, certified letters went out requesting all Cedar Ridge HOA records from the past 3 years. The investigation uncovered a pattern: selective enforcement, arbitrary fines, no meaningful appeal process, targeting vulnerable residents, widows, recent inheritors, elderly folks on fixed incomes. Thousands in questionable assessments, families forced to sell rather than fight. Community meetings grew heated as residents who'd stayed silent for years finally spoke up. $800 for garden decorations, threats of liens over minor fence disputes, $2,000 in review fees for already approved repairs. At an emergency town hall packed beyond capacity, testimony after testimony painted the same picture. When the vote came to remove Diane as president, it was overwhelming: 87 in favor, 11 against. A new board was elected that night, led by Tom Jenkins, a retired teacher who'd lived there 20 years. They accepted the county settlement, a $2,500 fine, mandatory training for all board members, 6 months of oversight, and a real resident complaint process. 6 months later, I returned for the final compliance inspection. Cedar Ridge felt different, lighter. Property values had risen, no harassment complaints on file, and the association earned the county's first model HOA certification. Appeals worked, rules were clear, and enforcement served the community instead of ruling it. At the mailbox cluster, I ran into Diane. She looked smaller somehow, dressed in jeans and a sweater, tending a flower bed where she'd once stood watching my cabin through binoculars. "Mr. Thompson," she said quietly, "may I have a word?" We spoke for a few minutes. She admitted she'd convinced herself intimidation was protection, that strict control maintained standards. Living under fair rules now, seeing how the community thrived with real due process, she understood the harm she'd caused. "I can't undo the fear I put into people," she said. "But seeing what real oversight looks like, I'm glad it exists, even if I had to learn the hard way." I told her recognition was the first step, and changed behavior mattered more than apologies. Forgiveness would come in time if she kept being a good neighbor. Driving away, I thought about my grandfather's old saying, "The best victories turn bullies into better people." Cedar Ridge proved it possible. Justice came through paperwork and votes, not shouting. And in the end, everyone, including the person who'd needed the hardest lesson, won. What do you think about stories like this? Have you ever seen power abused in a neighborhood, workplace, or community group? Do you believe people like Diane can truly change, or does it take consequences to force growth? Where do you draw the line between protecting standards and outright bullying? Drop your thoughts below. I read every comment, and I'm genuinely curious about your experiences and opinions.